Hey, y'all. I'm so glad that you are joining us today for this podcast style conversation. Our goal was to hopefully create this video to help people who are wondering about the foster care system or wondering about what is it like to be a foster or adoptive parent here in North Carolina. There's a lot of commonly asked questions and commonly wondered things or concerns that people might have on the journey. And we want to create this video, create this conversation to hopefully answer some of those questions. So I am Keith Fortier, and I'm the Director of Advancement for Agape of North Carolina. And I get to work with churches and I get to collaborate with other nonprofits and work with government officials to hopefully create some real solutions for kids and families in need, and hopefully create more than enough foster homes and more than enough adoptive homes for all the children in need. And I'm here with Greg, who is a foster and adoptive dad. And he's also a volunteer for Agape and has done a lot to bless and serve us. And he's going to help us with the conversation, help ask some questions and provide some responses along the way. So thanks for helping and being part of the conversation.
Yeah, Keith, I'm so excited for you all to hear this, because as a foster and adoptive father myself, just as you are, there's so many things before the process and even throughout the process that you don't know, that you're curious about. And a lot of things that probably keep people from taking action is just the lack of knowledge.
Yeah.
So hopefully today we can get into that.
Yeah.
So where we're going to start is just identifying 4 buckets of different audiences or people who have these questions around foster care and caring for the vulnerable. And so we've identified those as unaware or uninformed. There are those who proactively are curious about foster care and adoption, and what does that look like? There's those who have identified themselves as people who could never adopt or foster, but they still want to do something. And then lastly, we have church leaders, those who are trying to bring a foster care culture and movement into their church, but are uncertain really how to start. They see this biblical call to it for all people, but they don't know where to start. And so we thought today would be a great place to start at that unaware or uninformed with a simple but important question. What is foster care and why is it important?
Yeah, it's very important to start there, because without understanding in our local context here in North Carolina, what does foster care mean? It's hard to know how to even begin to engage. Foster care simply is children who are in need of a temporary living situation. So there are many children here in North Carolina who are experiencing neglect or abuse. Those are the most common reasons why kids are coming into foster care. Sometimes there's mental health struggles or other things of that sort. But the majority of kids who come into foster care are because of reports of neglect or abuse, where the county and government officials have investigated and deemed it unsafe for those children to be where they are. And they need a temporary living situation. They need somebody to love them and care for them while the social workers and while the courts and the appropriate officials are determining that their home and their parents are safe again. And I think that we have a tendency to, in our mind, to make assumptions about those parents. And our mind usually jumps to the worst case scenario, which there are horrific worst case scenarios, but the majority of kids who come into foster care are not those situations. Actually, the majority of kids who come into foster care, it's about 70%, typically are because of reports of neglect, which are usually related to poverty, issues of hunger and not having food, not having the things they need. Like, we're typically talking about good parents who love their children, who are just really struggling to meet the needs of themselves and their children in their home. And unfortunately, those kids have to be removed temporarily while hopefully that home is being stabilized and supported. That's the biggest nuance, and the biggest misunderstanding is often, why are kids coming into foster care? There are situations with severe abuse, and there are things that, many children would come in, but more often than not, it has to do with neglect. And again, it is temporary. The goal is always reunification. Unfortunately, a lot of kids who come into foster care never actually make it home because sometimes it's quite hard to stabilize that home. But the goal is always to get kids back with their biological parents whenever it's possible and whenever it's safe. And if it is then deemed not possible or not safe, then those kids need a permanent home. They'll need to, the goal will be changed to adoption.
So this is obviously a large challenge and issue in North Carolina and across the United States. Why is there a need for more Christian families to step up and support these children?
Yeah, that's a great question. The need is enormous. We have about 12,000 children in North Carolina who are currently in the foster care system, and only about 5,500 foster homes. So there is a shortage. There has been a shortage. There has been a foster care crisis of sorts for a long time. But, if a crisis goes on long enough, people stop talking about it, or just the awareness goes down. So people are often unaware that we have children sleeping in DSS buildings all around the state. Like even right here, we're sitting in downtown Raleigh right now, and not more than 2 miles away from us, there's about probably on average, the building over there has about 25 kids sleeping in it on any given day. And those kids who are there are in that building because of a shortage of homes. Some kids will be there for days, weeks, or even months. And without more families who are willing to open their homes, but more realistically open their hearts and their lives, right? Like it is costly to love a child in that much need. Without more families to do that, there is no solution. And the longer kids are bouncing from temporary home to temporary home, or when kids are placed in group homes, which is often the case when there's a shortage of foster homes, like there are many group homes around North Carolina. We don't like to think of America as having orphanages, but it kind of has that feel of, 20, 30 kids sleeping in one building with staff who change. Those group homes are not where children are meant to be. They're meant to be in families. So as long as kids are bouncing from home to home or sleeping in group homes or sleeping in offices, the longer they do that, the harder it is for their little hearts to feel secure and stable and loved and begin to heal. So more foster families is the only way. And really, the people of God, right? Your question was, why is more Christian foster families necessary? Fostering is really intense and really hard. And many foster parents burn out within the first few months because it's challenging. But Christians, we have a different kind of compassion and a different kind of capacity. And we have the Holy Spirit, and we have an ability to suffer for these children, because that's really what it is, right? And we have Christ who modeled it for us, who he suffered for us so that we can be made healed and whole. And he calls us to do the same. And foster parents, Christian foster parents, tend to be the ones who are capable of doing this because God first loved us. He modeled it for us. In my opinion, the solution to the crisis really is the people of God and believers, churches. So
yeah, absolutely. And so for Christians specifically, and I'm sure this relates to those who are unbelievers as well, but
yeah.
What are some of the primary reasons people feel like this isn't something that they can do or be a part of?
Yeah, I think people disqualify themselves for a lot of reasons. There is so many reasons to say that we should not do that. I mean, the biggest, which is, we live in a culture, an American culture, that tells us to be comfortable, to be safe, to insulate ourselves from anything that's hard or costly. We live in a culture that values success and portraying that we are successful, having big, beautiful homes and having respectful children and having beautiful family dinners where we all sit around the table and have nice conversation and taking fancy vacations and posting about them on Instagram and retiring at the perfect age and living a cushy cushy, comfortable life. And foster care is the exact opposite of all those things. It's willingly walking into somebody else's hard situation. So in order to say yes to foster care, you have to actually say no to living based on how American, and I would say even church culture, Christian culture often buys into an American dream kind of mindset. And you have to actually say no to that comfortable mindset to say yes to foster care. That's probably the biggest reason why people disqualify themselves, even unknowingly, that they think, well, that's too hard. Even when we were starting the process to be foster parents, we had 3 children under the age of 3 biological children under the age of 3. And we felt like God was pulling on our heart to start the process to be foster parents. And everybody from every angle was telling us we shouldn't, even within our own church. The most common message was, well, God's not going to give you more than you can handle. And that sounds like more than you can handle. And we had to wrestle with that. And ultimately I got to the point of saying, but wait a second, where does it say that in my Bible that God won't give me more than I can handle? Because I'm pretty sure it's full. My Bible is full of stories of people who were given more than they could handle. And God showed up in all those situations. So the messages we receive from the people around us, from the culture, is that we should not be doing hard and costly things. So that's often the biggest reason why people say, I don't know if I can do that. That feels too costly. It feels too painful. It feels too messy. And among other reasons, they have fears and concerns about are they able to parent kids with that kind of, hard history, or how will they love and support their biological children in the process, or what will it be like to love a child and then let them go, right? Like so many people say, oh, I would get too attached. So there's all these fears and concerns that people have, but most of them go back to that same root of what do we believe about life and following Jesus? And are we going to live a gospel-centered life, which calls us to lay ourselves down for others, or are we going to live a comfortable life?
Yeah, those are amazing points and real challenges. And I think one of our natural inclinations is to not want to step into something that we're not already equipped for. Yet, like you said, biblically, God puts so many people in positions where they aren't equipped and they need God desperately to show up where it won't succeed.
Yeah. Yes.
Now, thinking of that, though, there are specific reasons why people shouldn't adopt or be a foster parent. So just off the cuff from myself, and I'd love to hear you share this, but like people who come from a really challenging background from where they were grown up, and they haven't gone through that and really processed whether they went through foster care themselves or had a really messy parenthood and unsafe home.
Yeah.
If you don't have that stuff worked out, that could be a challenge for bringing trauma into your home when you haven't addressed the trauma of your own. So are there any other situations where people should potentially seek wisdom or help before they step into?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think most of those places where people should have pause and really consider and pray before they get involved, they often revolve around one big question, which is our goal in fostering and or adopting, is our goal centered around meeting the needs of a child or children and showing up for them in a meaningful way to love them and support them? Or are our goals actually rooted in some way in trying to fulfill something inside of us, trying to meet some kind of need that we have or a void that we have in our own life or in our own heart? Because if we're trying to fill some kind of void for ourselves and trying to do that by bringing this child into our life, usually that's a recipe for pain and new levels of brokenness. Whereas if our goal is to actually step into the life of that child and to love them, even in the midst of their brokenness, that's where there can be health in the mission. So some of those things where it is more about us that we need to look out for is our goal simply to build our family? For some people, they're like, man, but we really want to add to our family. Or sometimes if you are grieving the very painful process of infertility and trying to think like, but we really want to have a child in our home, or we've always dreamed of adding to our family through foster care and adoption, which is not bad. I was somebody who dreamed of adding children to my family through foster care and adoption. But if the goal is to add beauty into our family, sometimes people come with the wrong expectation when you're actually adding brokenness, willingly bringing brokenness. A lot of foster parents step into foster care with the mindset that this child from their broken past and broken places are going to come into my home, and where things are healthy and well, and all of their brokenness will melt away, and they will be healthy and whole, and they'll fit in beautifully. And more realistically, it typically feels more like that child did not come into our world. It feels like we've stepped into their world, and their brokenness doesn't actually melt away when they're in your home. Their brokenness actually starts to feel like it's your brokenness. Like you take it on in ways where you feel the heaviness of what this child has been through. And often the trauma that this child has been through, when we start to wrestle with it, it actually amplifies anything, like you were saying, like anything from our past or things that were unresolved, of our own unresolved childhood. Caring for a child with significant trauma often multiplies the trauma that we've already have existing within us. And all of a sudden it feels like we're just spewing, and we're like, I am not the heroic parent that I thought I was. I just feel like a sinful, broken person, which is not bad, right? Like we need to be aware of our brokenness to access those places of healing. But a lot of people run into trouble when they start to realize, oh, there's actually unresolved things in me that I was unaware of. And now I'm trying to care for this child in the midst of all of my own brokenness. So those are some of the biggest things, is just really evaluating your motives. Like if we're just trying to feel like we're like a good Christian, and this is like, oh, I need to check this box in my life. I'm like, this is not a box to be checked. Like this is a mission to walk prayerfully and with lots of discernment into. And the more that we can put the children at the center of the story, and this is about stepping in to love them, and we can make it about Christ, and we can make it about the kids, and the less it's about us and what we're hoping and dreaming, usually the healthier it is.
Yeah. That's really strong and profound. I love how you broke that down. And one thing I'd love to jump into a little bit is thinking about the biological parents.
Mm-hmm.
So to start this, like I, as an adoptive father, I went through a unique path of, we lived in another state and worked with an agency that focused on low legal risk foster to adopt placements.
Mm-hmm.
So we originally went into it very much with the pure desire of adoption.
Yeah.
And that's not bad. But when you're doing that in the foster system, it somewhat defeats a little bit of the purpose of reunification.
Yeah.
And I would love for you to just help those listening today. Like, how do you cultivate a heart for the parents in this? And what are ways that this kind, being a Christian foster family, can actually bring wholeness to families as well?
Yes, that's a great question. I'll probably even start by even addressing the comment of like, foster to adopt. It is a very commonly used phrase that we hear in this world, where people say, oh, like, we're foster parents, or, oh, we're fostering to adopt. As we've grown more aware of the children, the parents, and everybody involved, really the triad of sorts, where there's children and there's biological parents and there's foster adoptive parents, become this triad of relationship that doesn't go away, right? Like a child. So I have 3 children who are now, adopted. We cared for 17 kids over a span of time, 3 who going home was never going to be part of their story. And I have the great privilege of being their dad. But the biological relationships of my adopted children, they will exist forever. As much as I love my daughters and my son, like we like to think that our love is enough. Like our love meets so many needs of their heart, but our love for them does not erase their longing for those biological connections. And all 3 of my kids who we fostered kids of many different ages, but the 3 that we ended up adopting did come as infants, and they have different relationships with biological parents. Like I have one daughter who has lots of connection and can call her biological mom regularly, and we're sending pictures. And I have one son who, when he left the hospital, and left his biological mom at the hospital, he has not seen her since, and he might not see her ever again. And the nature of her struggles is that we pray that she's still alive, right? And we're like longing and hoping for her, but it is unlikely that he's going to meet her anytime soon, even if at all. But that does not change the fact that he asks about her and he wants to pray for her and he thinks about her. And as he grows, he'll have more questions. And those relationships exist forever. So honoring those relationships and speaking about parents with dignity and with respect, and creating space for our adopted kids in their wonderings and in their fears and in their concerns, their questions, like creating space for them to just be fully who they are and have their own healing process is important. But back to the question of foster to adopt, right? Like a lot of times when we say we're fostering to adopt, it almost tells the children from the very beginning that what our goals are, right? Because that's more about our motives than what's actually, if we say I'm fostering to adopt, then we've almost erased our dream of those kids being back with their parents if that was safe and appropriate. Now, that being said, there are children in North Carolina, many of them, who they know will never be going back to their parents. It's called termination of parental rights. So some parents, their rights have been terminated. The kids will not be returning. And then those children do need permanent adoptive homes. And there's not enough of them. There's many kids who grow up in the foster care system. They never get adopted and they end up aging out and become adults without permanent family. And those kids need adoptive homes. And so we need people to be licensed. They become a licensed foster parent and they adopt waiting children. So you can adopt children through the foster care system. But when we foster children whose goal is reunification, and we say that we're fostering to adopt, the message to that child is already that, and the message to the biological parent, it's like, oh, these people are fostering to adopt. We're not hoping or praying or fighting for those parents at that point. We're not dreaming of kids being back in their first place where they truly belong. Obviously, we want children in safe and loving homes, which is beautifully redemptive. But the full picture of redemption, like a God-sized picture of redemption, does not just involve children. It involves families and families that were broken and falling apart, and believing for redemption for parents. And one of your questions that you asked was, how does this reach parents? And the reality is when we have that mindset where it's like, we're loving this child fiercely and we're loving their family where they came from, whether it's safe to be connected with them or not, whether we are able to meet parents, but if we're praying for parents and we're believing for redemption, when those biological parents do meet us and they see that we love their child and we love them and we don't judge them, it actually opens the door for all kinds of beautiful relationship and opens the door for the gospel when parents start wondering, wow, I expected these foster parents to judge me. I expected these foster parents just to be wanting my child and hoping to keep my child. But instead I find love and care. And it seems like these people are genuinely fighting for me and they want to see my child back home as fast as possible. And then when we stay connected with those parents afterwards and support them, because typically those parents did not have people who supported them. But when we do love and support parents that way, they get to see Jesus in beautiful ways, and it opens the door for relationship and the gospel. I've seen it over and over again with biological parents that we've gotten to support, and I think that a lot of foster parents are missing that part of reflecting Christ within this system by ignoring biological parents.
Something that I've learned, even in the most recent years, is as much as we'd like to, in anything we do as believers, our motives are not fully pure. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't use somewhat incorrect motives to do amazing things and then change our own hearts. Because I know that in our process of adopting our son, and reunification never was really on the table.
Yeah.
It took a while for me to actually view mom, who's primarily the person in the picture, not as an enemy, for lack of better terms.
Yeah.
But as someone in broken and desperate need of love and care as well.
Yeah.
And God really changed our hearts and allowed us to experience her brokenness and kind of work through that.
Yes.
And so
that's really good.
God does move through that over time.
Well, I think a lot of people, we naturally, in every story, look for the hero and the villain. In foster care and adoption, I think we wrongfully place ourselves in the position of hero, where there really only is one hero, and that's Jesus, right? Like we are nobody's savior. Like we are people who have been saved. There's only one savior. And we look for the villain, and we usually place that on biological parents. We're like my first foster daughter, who had been, she was 11 months old, had been wildly neglected. She was alone in her crib for the first 11 months of her life and very malnourished. And my mind quickly went to, who did this to this little girl? Like, how could this have happened to this sweet little girl who's now so frail and so broken? And my mind made mom the villain. But then when I met mom and got to know her and found out that she grew up in foster care herself, that she aged out of foster care when she was 18, was picked up by traffickers almost immediately, and was abused and ended up addicted. And when I got to know her and her story and quickly realized that, like, oh my goodness, that mom is just as much of a victim as that little girl in the crib. My mind finally realized, okay, biological parents are not the villain. There's only one villain. It's the same enemy that's been tearing families apart from the beginning, which is the enemy, right? It is the accuser. It's the same enemy that has been bent on destruction. So we have one enemy and one savior. But the sooner we realize, that we are nobody's hero and parents are not the villain, the sooner we can start to have more healthier motives, more Christ-centered motives, I think.
That's amazing. So speaking of Christ-centered, what does the Bible have to say about caring for vulnerable children?
That's good. Wow. I have to record a lot more of these conversations.
Just share a few things.
It's good. My mind quickly goes to, it can be overdone sometimes in James 1, right? Caring for pure religion, pure faultless religion, caring for orphans and widows in their distress, and keeping oneself polluted by the world is what it says. A lot of times people take those scriptures and they call it a command to care for the vulnerable children and families in our community. But the funny thing is that scripture is not a command at all. Like there is no command language. Like it says, this is pure and faultless religion. It's not saying like, I command you to go care for foster children in need. It's more of a describing verse. And there is other verses like, in Micah, love mercy, act justly, walk humbly. Like there's these verses that people use to be like, okay, this is a command to live in a certain way in relation to the vulnerable. But those verses are describing what it looks like to live a life of following Christ. They're not commands. It's more of like a summary. So that James verse is breaking down, or the Micah verse is really breaking down, like, we know what it looks like to live this life of following Christ, or even breaking down, like, we are part of the family of God. Like this, like, y'all know what it looks like to live this life. It looks like loving the most vulnerable among us. The difference would be, I've got two sons who share a room. They are, 12 and 8, and they have a messy room, right? And if a command is I say, go clean your room. I say, boys, I need you to clean your room. Like, that's a command. It's more like if I said, hey, guys, just imagine what it would be like if your drawers were neat and your clothes were folded, or imagine you could walk through your room and not step on Legos in the middle of the night. Like, wouldn't that be amazing to live in a room that has order and structure? It's like describing to them what it would look like. That James verse is what it's doing. It's like, hey, let me give you a picture of what it looks like to live the life of following Christ. Like, imagine what it would look like in us and around us if we live the life of displaying God's heart for the vulnerable. The whole book of James is breaking it down and saying, like, this is the life that we're called to live. We're not just talking about following Jesus. We're doing the things of the kingdom. Like surely somebody who is full of the Spirit of God and walking in the authority of God in their life, there's going to be things that we do, right? The whole, like, faith without works kind of thing that people wrestle with. Like, it's just describing, it's like, guys, obviously this is what it looks like when we walk with Christ. The people around us who are desperately in need, they are cared for. They are loved. They are covered because of who we are. This is just going to flow out of who we are. Like, here is a picture of the life of being part of the family of God, of being part of the kingdom. The vulnerable are loved. The orphan has parents. The widow is covered and cared for. The single mom in your community is loved and supported. The refugee among you is wrapped up and cared for. Like, there's these summarizing verses that almost say, you're part of the family of God. You have the Father's DNA in you. Do you not know who your Father is? Do you not know what the family business is? Like, this is the family business, is redeeming the broken places in this world, going and showing up, taking on that brokenness, not like in a heroic way, right? It's like Jesus stepped in and died so that we can be made whole. It's like we go and we step into these broken places. We bear the weight of that brokenness on us like a cross that feels like it's crucifying us. But our God is the God of resurrection. And even when we are suffering, there's a resurrecting spirit in us, and there's resurrecting brokenness in the world around us. And these redeeming things happen when the people of God live that reflection of who he is. And that verse captures at the end, right at the beginning, pure and faultless religion, and keep yourself undefiled. Or it says, talking about clean at the beginning and talking about clean at the end. Those who live clean, which in my mind, I often go to like that culture that pollutes us, the culture that tells us not to live this way. Keep ourselves clean of that culture that just keeps us from living a sacrificial life. But then those who live that life, those who care for the orphan and widow in their distress, keeps them from being polluted by the world, because doing it keeps you away from the culture also. Like, if you're living that sacrificial life, it's almost impossible to live that polluted culture. The verse just captures the picture, not even a command, but this is the life of following God. Here's what it looks like. Here's what it feels like.
I love how you broke that down. And I think that's going to be super helpful for people, because a lot of times scripture is taken out of context.
Mm-hmm.
But to get to more of the heart of that most famous verse surrounding foster care and adoption. So as we wrap up this section of unaware and uninformed, a Christian who's now curious, you've stirred something up in them, where's the best place to start?
The best place to start is always in prayer. Beginning to pray moves things and changes things. When we pray, things change. So beginning to pray for vulnerable children in our community, parents, praying for foster parents, people who are already fostering, praying for grandparents who are raising their grandkids. There's about 70,000 of them in North Carolina who are, there's so many families and children that you can be praying for. And when you begin to pray, God changes things and he begins to change us, right? When we engage with God's heart, our motives become more pure. Things become clearer on what we're supposed to be doing or what we're not supposed to be doing. And finding your own unique way that we're supposed to be engaged. Prayer is always the first place to start. And asking more questions, praying and finding people to talk to. There's always people at Agape who are happy to talk. There's other foster parents in the community. Most churches have a foster parent or two who's very passionate and ready to talk, and start asking them questions about their journey. But praying and wondering and finding people to talk to, often the best places to go.
For those who are wanting to step into this prayer, but would like some guidance in how to pray, I know you guys have a resource. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I've been telling folks for many years that the best thing they can do is pray. And so Agape, just last year, we made a month-long prayer guide to help people walk through very tangibly things they can be praying for, like even some facts and stats about social workers and best ways to be praying for the social workers in our city, or best ways to be praying for foster parents and adoptive parents, or the biological parents, or the first responders who walk into places and find children in need. And there's all these different folks that we might never even think about who touch the foster care world, or they interact with kids who are vulnerable and in need. And our prayer guide will give very specific ways to help people know what's happening in our community and how can we be praying.
That's beautiful. So we are now wrapping this unaware, uninformed section, and we're shifting into the bucket that we're calling Christians who have identified that they feel some sort of calling towards foster care and or adoption, and the questions that would benefit them.
Yeah.
And so where I want to start there is literally a question about where to start. So for those who they feel God stirring in their heart, and it may be just after they listen to the first part of this conversation, where can they start? And we're not going to think nationally, we're thinking here in North Carolina, and we can even think specifically with Agape.
Yeah.
But they've prayed through it. They've spent time feeling there is a calling towards this. What is the next step for them?
Yeah, that's great. I think the practical next steps are determining the path to fostering, because there's not one way and there's not one right way. There is many different ways and many different, I'll call it flavors of foster care. There are amazing nonprofits who are helping stabilize families, that helping prevent kids from coming into foster care in the first place. Folks could step into very temporary fostering situations where they're actually helping care for families in need and providing a weekend of support, caring for kids for a weekend or a week, while great nonprofits are loving and supporting parents and trying to help families not fall apart at all. So you could get trained to do short-term emergency foster care. And that's with, these organizations like Safe Families or other mentoring organizations that walk with biological parents. And if you are considering being a fully licensed foster parent, there are even different paths for doing that, where you could, in most counties, some counties don't license their own foster parents, but in many counties, you could approach the county and be licensed directly with Wake County, for example, or Durham County, and they run foster parenting classes and the licensing process. And then there's also private agencies like Agape, and there's many others. And then even within the private agencies, there are agencies that do, in North Carolina, what's called family foster care, which is what we would say is more typically developing children with, there's no child who doesn't have high needs in foster care, because being removed from their families is always traumatic, and trauma comes with changes to a child's brain and body that sometimes makes more challenging behaviors. So Agape and many agencies will do family foster care, which is more typically developing children. And then other agencies you'd have to look into, or you might notice, will say they do therapeutic foster care, or they might call it leveled, which are kids who have higher needs or kids who have more complex trauma, or they might have medical needs, kids with, a G tube or with different kinds of diagnoses. So just even praying, considering like, okay, where am I called? Am I called to short-term respite type activities? Am I called to loving and caring for a child for the long haul, right? Through family foster care and loving a child and doing everything we talked about before about like dreaming about reunification and praying for parents. But then if that child is unable to reunify, are you a family who is able and willing to adopt a child who's placed into your home? Or are you a family that wants to care for medically fragile children or kids who have some of the hardest needs and some of the most complex histories, and you want to be licensed to do therapeutic foster care? It's challenging, but man, do we need people who would say yes to doing that as well? So even just praying, considering what is the right path for you, is really the first step. And calling agencies, talking to people who are fostering, and asking those questions will help you to get more clarity. And you can certainly call Agape and call our social work director and even process some of your own family and life questions and try and find where's the best fit for you. So,
Now, being super practical, Agape specifically, if someone is in the early stages of pursuing foster care and they want to do that through Agape, is there like an entry level course, or what is that first practical step?
Yes. So in order to foster, you do have to be a licensed foster parent. And there are some things, some requirements even laid out by the state of North Carolina that any agency, or if you foster directly through the county, they have to meet certain requirements. So there's certain training, certain courses. A lot of people do those courses as groups. So like if you get licensed through Wake County, they run the class twice a year, or sometimes more. And some agencies will run classes quarterly. At Agape, we license families individually. So as they're ready, they're licensed one-on-one. We have our trainers who do the meetings with folks. There's some booklets that we read, and we have our own process of fulfilling all of the requirements of the state of North Carolina. Make sure that we jump through all the right hoops and do the process well, do the appropriate trauma training and the appropriate parenting trainings, and there's certain questions and getting to know you and getting to know your history and your background and your parenting style and making sure that when we place a child in your home, that we know you well and know which kids would thrive in your home. So making sure we do that well. But then there's also things at Agape that we've added to the training, just even on the spiritual side and the faith side. Some of the stuff we're talking about today, like making sure that parents are truly ready for this journey of loving and suffering alongside children who really need people to suffer with them. So at Agape, it can often be a 3 to 6 month process. We sometimes move it quickly because we license families individually. We can pace it. So sometimes we move it quickly if folks are really ready to go, and sometimes we slow it down if they're in a journey and they're still wondering and questioning and trying to find out what's right for them. But there is a real practical licensing process that ultimately at the end, regardless of where you choose to be licensed with any agency or with the county, that eventually makes you a official licensed foster parent. And we need to do that whole process and do it well before kids are allowed to be placed in your home.
That's super helpful. So for those who become a foster family, what kind of support's out there for them? What ways can they be supported in this?
Yeah, we are helping build a beautiful support network. Not just with Agape. Like Agape, we understand that we are part of what God is doing in the midst of this mission. We are not the center of the mission. That's for sure. We are part of the family of God, part of the people of God. And there are many different amazing nonprofits and many other foster agencies that we collaborate with. And most importantly, churches. There are many churches that are finding their role in the midst of this foster world. And as they do that, as churches do it, they start to build things like support groups or supply closets or foster parent night outs where people can drop off their kids and take a night out. And there is a growing network of resources that are becoming more widely available for foster parents among this greater network of different nonprofits and agencies and churches, and making sure that people get connected to all the right resources and that nobody's getting slipped through, nobody's slipping through the cracks. We are growing that unity across the body of Christ. It's something we've been working on for the last couple of years here in North Carolina, saying, okay, there's many different parts of the body, but we're all one body of Christ. And how do we have churches have unity and nonprofits have unity? And ultimately, the more we do that, the more we can have better strategy that no foster or adoptive parent is slipping through the cracks, right? Like nobody should be struggling alone. There's so many great resources, so many great support groups. And even like for our Agape foster parents, like our social workers are making sure that they're all cared for and connected to the different resources. But for any foster parent in our community, that there is nobody who is struggling alone. So yes, lots of great resources, and it's growing. We're at an exciting time here in North Carolina where we're changing the landscape, and more churches are getting involved, and more people are learning how to do it well. So it's a great time. And practically, one of the biggest things we've been doing is helping churches learn even the things that they might be called to do, like run a support group or run a supply closet, or start engaging with young men and women who've aged out of foster care and support them. And no matter what they're doing, a non-negotiable is radically supporting the families in their church who are fostering. That is first and foremost a step in the process that can't be missed. So training churches to know strategically, how do they do that? What does it look like to support a foster parent well? So anybody who's becoming newly fostered, it's one of the things that we're checking on. It's like, okay, what church are they a part of? Does this church have the tools and equipping they need to support them well? As a foster care agency, there's certain things we can do to support a family, but there's certain kinds of support that really should come from their local church, and making sure that churches are ready to do that.
Yeah. So to wrap up this section, we're going to do one last question, which is, a family has stepped in. They are now fostering a child,
Mm-hmm.
a group of children, and some things come up that they no longer feel like they can handle,
Mm-hmm.
whether that's a medical issue that comes up or
Yeah.
an emotional thing, or potentially, like we discussed earlier, they have some unaddressed trauma that they didn't even know
Mm-hmm.
comes up, and they don't feel emotionally equipped
Yeah.
to handle this. What does that look like? How can they approach that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really hard place to be in. And I know that experience. I've been there as a foster dad. We had a 4-year-old little girl and 3-year-old little boy who had been through every kind of trauma imaginable, which we did not know when they came into foster. The social workers did not know. When they first came into foster care, the social workers told us and believed that it was only going to be maybe a week or so, that they needed to just get a little bit of support to the family, need to stabilize a few things at home, needed to just fix a few little things that were off, and they were going to get these kids back home pretty quickly. But after the kids came into care, there was 4 kids total. 2 of them were at our home. And after they came into care, it became radically obvious that these kids have been through so much worse than anybody had imagined. Like every kind of abuse that you might wonder, they had experienced it. We were not emotionally prepared for the journey of what it would look like to care for those kids. Because obviously it wasn't just a weekend or a week. Those kids ended up staying for about 4 months. And like I said earlier, in the previous section, kids don't come from their brokenness into our world. We enter into their brokenness with them. So the weight of all of what this little girl and little boy went through, that started to sit on my soul my wife is very practical, and she's like practically gets overwhelmed by all of the appointments and all the details, and um, and all of the intensity of investigations that were happening, and intensity of the court cases, and the endless social workers in and out of our home, like overwhelmed her, whereas the emotional aspects and of loving these kids well overwhelmed me. And I began to break in ways that I wasn't ready for. I became very anxious, and started to struggle with my own mental health issues. And it became obvious over time that these children needed a higher level of care than what we could do in our home. That's a really awful place to be in, because my inability to care for them and with their complex trauma did not change how much I loved them, did not change how much I wanted to care for them well. It just was not something we were able to do. But when a foster parent feels like they've entered into something and now it's clear that they can't continue it, the natural feeling is that I must be a failure, or I've failed these children if they have to move on. And that's devastating. That is a really, really hard place to sit in when you feel like you're failing. But that's when you have to actually go back to the gospel and Jesus, and remember that you are nobody's savior, that you are somebody who's been saved, and that ultimately we play our part that God's called us to play for these children. And sometimes the part that we play is loving them for that time, and then helping them get to the more appropriate place where they should be. Right? Those kids were able to move from our home to a more appropriate placement where their needs could be met. And that is not a failure. It's not a failure when kids get to where they should be. Sometimes our home is a step along the journey, but keeping Christ at the center and making sure that we're not labeling ourselves a hero, because there's no foster parents, I believe, who truly think, oh yeah, I'm the heroic one here. It's like, but they all just feel broken and like we're failing, and we're doing the best we can. And that's when we have to remember that the job of saving and redeeming is Christ's job, not our job. It's our job to walk with him in the midst of the journey, that we're just part of the story, that we have the great privilege of being a part of what God is doing in these kids' lives, in the world, in our communities. But if we think it's all about us and us doing the full, complete work, that's making us the savior, and that's not our job.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, to get practical,
Mm-hmm.
someone gets in that position. Let's say Agape is the one that they're licensed through, where they no longer feel equipped, or there is a higher level of care that is needed, like you referenced. Would they just speak to their social worker? What would that?
Yeah, it's really constant conversation and relationship with the social worker. The social worker becomes part of your story, helping navigate these questions with you, and helping kids ultimately get to where they need to be. So if a family is in that situation, it really is just a conversation with the workers about how they're doing. They're struggling. Sometimes the social worker might recommend it before a family even feels it, right? Like a family might be struggling and trying to hold it together, and it might be the social worker that says, hey, I really think this child needs to be moved to, a therapeutic placement, or, in North Carolina, they'll call it level 1, 2, or 3. They'll say kids need a higher level of care. So a child might move to a home that has a higher level of training. Or sometimes, they might determine, hey, this child, we didn't know it before, but they have a really complex trauma history that's coming to light, and this child probably shouldn't be in a home with other kids. We're going to move them to a foster home that has a higher level of training, and they'll be the only child or only children in the home. There's just times where they have to get to the right placement for that child. And whether it's a family that realizes it or a social worker, it's a conversation. And even more practically, if a family's like, hey, we really can't continue on, there's just a period of 10 days or sometimes a month where it might take to find a new placement for that child and then get them to where they need to be. But it's very simple. The social workers help. They help navigate the whole messy process because it is messy. It's emotionally messy. It's practically messy. But the Agape social workers get to walk that journey, or whatever agency you're a part of or you're licensed, the social workers get to walk it with families well.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And I think that's going to be helpful for people who are potentially in a challenging situation now.
Yeah.
But also for those who are afraid of being in a situation, it gives them a little bit of like preparedness, but also like how can they handle that if they get into it and not have to be afraid. So that kind of wraps our section on those who have decided they do want to move forward and take steps towards foster care. And it brings us into this next bucket that we described as those who feel like they just can't. They've identified that they can't be a foster parent for whatever reason that may be. But they still want to know, how can they help? They do recognize there is calling and purpose for all believers to step in and help in some way. And so when we first started having some conversations, you shared this analogy of the river. And it was a parable that was adjusted to specifically talk about caring for vulnerable children, by someone named Jason Johnson. So can you give us a picture of the river and how that gives people an idea of the many different ways that people can support vulnerable children and their families?
Yeah, absolutely. This parable of sorts is one of the quickest and easiest ways for people to wrap their mind around how they might get involved or to find that tug in their heart of where God's calling them. And if you're interested more in some of Jason Johnson's writings, you can definitely find more information about the parable. But it kind of goes like this. So if you can imagine that you and two friends are standing at the banks of a river, and to your horror, you find that there are children floating in the river. Right? Not just a few children, like hundreds of children are floating down the river by you. So naturally, your instincts tell you to jump in the river and start grabbing children. So you do. You jump in the river and you grab children as fast as you can and pull them onto dry land. One of your friends looks downstream and realizes that this river is going towards a waterfall. And if those children make it to the edge of the waterfall, there's no hope left. Like, we've lost them. So your friend runs downstream to try and stop as many kids from going over the edge of the waterfall as possible. While your other friend looks upstream and wonders, wait, how did these kids get in the water in the first place? Like, if there are kids floating by us at this spot, then something must have happened up there. And your friend runs upriver to try and figure out, how are kids getting in the water and how do we stop it? So in this image, we have three friends who are doing radically different jobs. And they rightfully should be doing different things. If they were doing the same thing at different points in the river, then it probably wouldn't be impactful. They have different jobs that are equally important on different places of the river. And those children that are floating at the center of the river with you jumping in, that really represents foster care, right? There are children who are floating in the system who need to be brought onto dry land. But many children don't get pulled from the water. They float in foster care for many years, ultimately floating down towards what in foster care we'd often call aging out, where there are many children who grow up in foster care. Their biological parents have their rights terminated. They need an adoptive home, but they don't ever get an adoptive home. And they end up turning 18 and aging out of the system without ever having been adopted. I mean, just for context, like here in Wake County, people estimate there's probably about 50 or so young men or women who age out of foster care every year. And that waterfall of aging out is really, young adults who age out, more than half of them end up homeless on day one. Some people estimate as many as 70% of the girls who age out in some communities get picked up by traffickers almost immediately because traffickers prey on the vulnerable. The addiction rates are through the roof. Incarceration rates are through the roof. Early pregnancy. But if you follow the thread of young men and women who age out, even you can pull it all the way down to 20 or 30 years less life expectancy. The waterfall is those young men and women who age out. Whereas the friend who goes upstream of the river, that is where we would say is family stabilization, preventing kids from coming into foster care in the first place. Like, how do we engage with vulnerable families where, like, so here in Wake County, there's about 475 kids in foster care currently. Those are kids who've been removed from their families because of neglect or abuse. And those children only represent a fraction of the open cases. So the open cases meaning there was a report of neglect or abuse. Social workers went out and investigated. And most of the time, they find children and families in need, and they decide not yet to remove the children. So the vast majority of open cases are families that are still intact, that we are hoping and praying that those kids are never actually removed. Because if those kids end up in the river, it is so much harder to actually, it's so much harder. It's more costly. It's more traumatic. And it is rare that we can actually get kids back home. It is so much better for everybody if kids never end up in the river in the first place, if families are stabilized and families stay together. So there's incredible nonprofits and people who are working to try and keep families together. So in this analogy of the river, we have very different roles, and there's all different places along the river that we need people strategically positioned, right? Like, we dream of a day where there is, not just 3 friends along a river, right? There's hundreds of churches and nonprofits that are all strategically placed along the river, doing their own unique role in keeping families together, making sure there's enough foster or adoptive homes, changing the outcomes for youth aging out. Because ultimately, the river itself, right, the young men and women who age out of foster care, the reasons why they struggle, like incarceration, addiction, early pregnancy, are also the reasons why families fall apart in the first place. It becomes cyclical, where we have kids who are coming into foster care because of homelessness and incarceration and trafficking. And then we also have kids coming out of foster care who struggle with the same things. So it becomes a broken cycle within our community. And until we have enough churches, nonprofits, and people strategically along the river playing their own unique part, then we don't ever break the cycle.
So we spent a lot of time speaking primarily to that middle of the river, jumping in and saving as many kids as possible. And do you have a few practical, like, for someone who's trying to go, like, whether it's an individual or a church that wants to be upstream and help keep children in their families, and downstream, help them from going off the waterfall. What are a few practical things that they could do now?
Yeah, that's great. One practical to not neglect at the center of the river is the support for foster and adoptive families that are doing it. Many people don't realize how many foster parents burn out very quickly, because being the one who jumps into the river and getting kids onto dry land is painful and hard, and it's often lonely. A lot of foster parents feel lonely. So one thing at the center, and we don't neglect the center of the river, right? That is just part of being the family of God, being part of having that, our Father's DNA, is that we don't watch kids float and do nothing. But if there are families in your church who are doing it, who are jumping in and pulling kids, then what can your church be doing to support them well? And what can you be doing? Right. A lot of times we help churches build what's called wraparound teams, which are people who are committed to supporting foster families really well as they do it. So there are ways of helping be an advocate or a champion in your church to create systems and structures to help care for the people who are doing it, who are jumping in at the center. So that is a very practical way or even if we aren't fostering, we can really be making a real difference. And then when looking downstream, there's great nonprofits in our community that are creating mentorship, um, housing, employment, transportation issues, right? There's all these barriers for young men and women who've aged out that cause exponential struggles in their life. But the biggest struggle and the biggest poverty is usually relational, right? Like a housing or an education barrier or a transportation barrier. Those things can be overcome, but they are usually not overcome by young men and women who have no relational support. If they don't have people who walk with them and care for them, we like young men and women who age out of foster care can go to college entirely free, but yet only 3% ever graduate from college. Right. And so it's not because the opportunity to go to college isn't there. When I think of when I first went to college, how many times I still called my parents on when I had a bad day or when I bombed a test and I was like, man, I just did so poorly on that thing, or I just slept through class and I feel like such a failure. But my dad could be like, shake it off and go to the next one. You're fine. Right. But how many times a young man who aged out of foster care, like me, bombs a test or misses class and is feeling like a failure and has nobody to call or no one to dust them off and put them back in, and they end up dropping out and moving on, just because they don't have the relational support that we're all meant to have. So being somebody who gets involved with those different nonprofits, the different people in the community who are trying to help, becoming equipped and trained for what does it look like to love people well, and not for a short while, right? Like this is not, like a young man who's aged out of foster care and is trying his best to go to college doesn't need somebody to have coffee with him once or twice, right? He needs someone to be a real champion and a real coach to walk with him for years, to really be a form of family, a place to show up on Thanksgiving break. A lot of young men and women who aged out, they're sleeping in their cars during when college shuts down, right? College shuts down for a few weeks, they're sleeping in their car. Um, if they're lucky enough to have a car, right? These are how ultimately they don't end up making it to the finish line because of all these vulnerabilities that they don't have someone to call, someone to fall back on. So being somebody who says, hey, I'm willing, like I can't foster, but I can do this for somebody. I can be the person who picks up the phone at 11 o'clock at night when they've had a bad day and they're thinking about, um, you know, quitting their job or quitting, and they just need someone to talk to them and give them some real positive truth in their life. So that's a very practical downstream. And then upstream, there's incredible nonprofits who are helping work to stabilize families. The first one that comes to mind is the friends of mine at Safe Families, where Safe Families has a few chapters around the state where they're working hard to try and support families well, and they need family coaches, people who be trained to coach families and mentor them. They need safe families, is what they call the families who are trained to care for children temporarily. So they need people to be trained to do that. They need people who are willing, again, to not just step in for a bit, but to be somebody who will walk with a family who's struggling, be a true and authentic friend to them, to be family alongside them and cheer for them and support them and pray for them, which is not an easy task or a light task, but it's something that is very much needed. It's very much a void. One of the biggest that I see here in North Carolina is a willingness for people to get involved in the messy and beautiful ministry of being people who walk with biological families who are struggling. So, upstream and downstream, there is plenty of opportunities for people to find their place. There's also all kinds of other opportunities like um, being a GAL. A GAL is a guardian ad litem, which are volunteers who are assigned to kids who are in the foster care system to be an advocate within the court system. So a guardian ad litem would be meeting with children and meeting with foster parents and meeting with social workers and basically being an unbiased third party who's evaluating the case and making sure that social workers are doing what's in the child's best interest, that the kid's voice is being heard well, that the foster parents are accountable and doing their part well, and just being another person who is tracking this case and advocating if something is not going well. Because unfortunately, there's a lot of times where a case is not going as it should, or a child is lingering in the system longer than they should. And the guardian ad litem is evaluating and writing a report that the judges take very seriously. And it's a volunteer role. Most counties in our state do not have a full GAL team. There's many kids who do not have one assigned to them simply because we don't have enough. And it's a very simple way with an hour or two a week to make a real impact in a child's life, to get to know them, to hear their story, and to be a champion and an advocate. And that's just a few examples. But right, there's a wide river of opportunities to get involved, whether it's with organizations like Lifeline that are doing, family coaching and running programs in churches, or Baptist Children Homes has some great friends of mine, or Watch Me Rise is running trauma trainings and creating resources for parents in the community. And there's a big network of people who are trying to help. And regardless of what kind of capacity you have or what you feel like you can or can't do, there's a place to get involved. Whether it's as simple as like making a meal for someone who needs food, um, helping get kids to appointments like by loving and serving a foster family, or whether it's walking long term with a single mom who's struggling and being for years being a friend and support to her. No matter what we feel like we can do, that there's a place along the river for it.
So I always love to get back to extra practical. And so for someone who's coming to Agape, they watch these videos, learned. Do you guys have like a resource list of different nonprofits and things where they can evaluate those different ends of the river?
Yeah. And I'd say the best place is there is a collaboration that Agape helped form alongside some other people in the community. And that collaboration is called RDU for FAMS, FAMS standing for Family Advocacy Ministries. So it is a collaboration of different nonprofits and churches who all consider themselves to be part of the puzzle, we say. It's like Agape is one piece of the puzzle. We are training and licensing foster homes. But there's all these different pieces of the puzzle that ultimately form the river, right? Where we are creating the resources, we are creating the network of support that exists for families that are struggling and foster families and youth aging out. And RDU for FAMS is really the champion of bringing together the who's who and the what's and how are the different ways that people can serve. So there is a website that folks can look at, which has a directory of all of the different nonprofits and what they do and ways that people could get involved, because there's many trusted partners is what we'd call it, like legitimate Christ-centered people who have a piece of the puzzle that they're trying to do well. Often one of the biggest things they're missing is people who are willing to get involved uh, and get their real life involved in serving as part of that ministry, right? There's a lot of believers and a lot of churches that want to buy backpacks or they want to buy gifts at Christmas. But what we need is for people to get their feet in the water, get their feet in the river. So whether it's with Safe Families or Lifeline or fostering through Agape or mentoring youth aging out through organizations like Hope and Vine or Tamarisk, there's all these trusted partners that are helping equip and mobilize people to get their feet in the water and start doing something. And RDU for FAMS is 100% the best place to learn more.
So something that I think would be helpful, you've already given some examples from your own journey as a foster parent and an adoptive parent. Looking back at the journey of being a foster parent, what is some support that you didn't have that you wish you had or would have made that process better for you guys?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think when I look back, I, like many foster parents, struggled with a little bit of that superhero mentality. where the feeling is often not if you start to struggle, but more likely when you start to struggle, people start to wrestle with, well, I thought I felt called to this. I thought that I was going to be a good enough parent for this. I thought that I was a good enough person. I thought that I was a good enough Christian. And now all of a sudden I feel like all this sin in me and I feel like I'm just failing my kids and um I don't feel like I'm enough for this. When we start to struggle like that, those feelings can start to be isolating if we don't bring them up. Right? Like when you walk through the door of church on Sunday morning and everyone around you is like, "Yay, you're an incredible person. You're like so heroic. Like you're doing this wonderful thing and you guys are amazing." But inside you're like, "I don't feel amazing. I feel pretty awful, actually." And if I even tried to explain to you what was happening inside my head or inside my heart, you wouldn't believe me. And if I even tried to tell you about the crazy stuff that just happened in my home a few minutes ago, you wouldn't believe me. So instead of trying to let people in and trying to explain it, when people ask how you're doing, folks are, most foster parents are like, "Oh, well, fine," because it's just too much. It's too complicated. Like I couldn't begin to let people in. And I think that is for me, when I look back, one of the biggest mistakes that I struggled alone for too long. I struggled silently and didn't let people walk with us. And it's not that I don't think people wanted to. I think I just felt like it was too complicated and too messy. And also felt like, well, this is my mission. Like God called me to this. So if God called me to this, then I need to bear the weight of it on me. When really, I don't think anybody's supposed to bear the weight of this alone. Like this is something that we need people around us. We need community. We need the body of Christ. We need folks to understand their place along the river might be supporting the foster parents who are doing it. So I took too long to let people in. And that um, left me and my wife and our kids with more struggle and more of our own pain than was necessary. So I think one of the things I learned was foster parents need to know before they get started that this is going to be hard and that they're going to need community and they're going to need support. And when they start to struggle, it's not a reflection on them or their character or their calling. It's just the big sign that they shouldn't be doing this alone, that the mission is too big and too heavy, too complicated, and they need community. They need support.
No, that is huge. Something that in our early stages of being foster parents, and we also took one short-term emergency infant placement.
Mhm.
Uh, People are much more apt to help in the very beginning
Mhm.
when they see the adventure and the excitement of it.
Yeah.
But the day to day, when it comes to like just struggling through those things, um, it's just how we're wired as humans. We have enough problems in our own life that we easily lose track unless there's something set up for continual support.
Yeah. And I think that's the key, right? Like something set up for continual support. That is something strategic and thoughtful, which is what foster parents need. Like I will often help pastors and communities and churches understand that here's the analogy I often use. Like if you were standing on a boat in the middle of the ocean and there was those raging seas out there and you knew you were about to throw somebody overboard into that water, you would put a life jacket on them before they went over. And we know that foster care is like being thrown into uncertain waters where you're going to get hit by wave after wave of emotion and fears and practicals of appointments and trauma behaviors and visits with biological parents. And you're going to have all your fears and insecurities. And if you are about to go into the water, you would want that life jacket on And the people throwing you overboard would want to put a life jacket on you. And that's what supports and relationships are. It's a life jacket that keeps you afloat, even in the midst of the mission. So people need the life jacket. They need to be willing to put it on before they get in the water. And their church and community around them needs to say, we're going to be your life jacket. You're going in and we're going with you.
That's so helpful. And so I have one question that's going to kind of transition us out of this bucket and into the final one.
Mm-hmm.
But I think this is important before we get to church leaders for individuals. So someone who is looking to create a ministry at their church, like we're going to spend some more time, like what it looks like from the church's side. But like, how would you encourage someone? They notice the church isn't doing anything specifically to support foster families, adoptive families. What's just a simple, practical way that they can move and get that going?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, if you are a person that is at a church and you're looking around saying, my church does not do anything to engage with the foster care system or this crisis, or my church has no place along the river. One, don't be discouraged. I feel like that's most churches. For most churches, they typically have a foster parent or two in the church. And the mentality is kind of like, oh, that's cute that they do that. That's a really beautiful thing. But it's just a thing that a few people do, mostly on their own. And it's not really understood and not really supported. So it's very typical. But it's also very typical that there are people in the church who are wondering and God's moving on their heart and believing that their church should be doing more. And practically for those folks, be encouraged that that your church can be a place where this is happening, that your church can be a place that has a place along the river and is serving vulnerable children and families. And real practically, like, don't try and do it alone. There is really great people who want to support churches, and you can't really do it alone without having folks at your church be on the same page, having unity across staff and leadership and members of the church who want to be a part of this. And there are also pastors who want to see this happen, but they can't really do it alone without people in their church that have capacity and vision and energy to do it. So it takes everybody, and it takes some steps of intentionality to create the environment in the church where this can start to grow. And that's the other thing, practically, is that it does need to grow. A lot of times we have this hurry in our heart to see something established at our church. And churches can put time and energy into forming a foster care ministry. We're like, hey, we're going to have this beautiful foster care ministry. But ministries can be built and can disappear just as fast as they're built. Whereas what's necessary is not a ministry. What's necessary is more of a culture where the church is living in alignment with God's heart towards the vulnerable, where they understand that this is not something that they get to pick and choose when it's important, that loving and serving children who are vulnerable and families that are vulnerable, this is a long, messy mission, and it's meant to be part of the DNA of the church. And that takes time. It takes time and intentionality to build a culture where this is normal. And that is something where church leaders and pastors and church members that are dreaming, it just takes some extra support and extra equipping and even extra unity with other churches around you that are still trying to fumble through their baby steps of doing it. And realizing that your church is just part of what God is doing, right? Like, there is a big picture of what God is doing to reach the families in our city. And there's not any one church or one nonprofit that's going to solve the problem alone. Like, this is something that we get to do together. So if you're somebody in a church who is wondering that, you can reach out to Agape. To me, I love getting churches equipped and supported. RDU for Fams is a beautiful network of different people who are helping, and events for people like you who are wondering, what can my church possibly be doing? How do we get started? There's good people who want to walk with your church and get you connected to what's happening in the big picture, and making sure that you get the long vision of the next 3 to 5 years of shifting culture into alignment with God's heart.
So speaking about shifting culture, let's shift to this next bucket,
That's good.
which is the church leaders who are going to be a big part of actually creating a culture within their church. I know lots of different churches that I've been a part of have had this mindset when someone comes in with this idea, like, hey, I really want this. A lot of times awesome, go for it. Start this ministry. And I think there's a good side to that, like calling your people into action. Because oftentimes we have this idea that like the pastors, the church staff should be the one that creates everything. But they need to, like you said, be in alignment to actually make movement. And so as we go into this new section of speaking specifically to church leaders on how they can build effective foster care cultures and caring for vulnerable children and their families, I'd love for you to first start on this thing where you shared with me this idea of creating strong testimonies and the impact of negative testimonies versus a positive one.
Yeah.
So talk about testimonies, the negative side and the positive side.
Yeah. I think one of the best ways to get into that is to tell you the predominant story that I hear from churches when I first start talking to them, which the predominant narrative that I hear is pastors will say something like, oh, foster care. We had a family that did that once and it went really poorly. Like we have a family that started to foster and it was really intense and really hard. They felt unsupported by their social workers or their agency that they were licensed through. They didn't really have help. They had kids with really big trauma reactive behaviors. They felt ill-equipped. Their marriage started to struggle and they closed their license and had to have those kids moved to another home pretty quickly. And it was a while before this family felt stable again. That's usually the story I hear. And the ripples around that pastor didn't often say is like the whole church was watching, right? People are watching this story, this narrative play out. And the message that everyone received was, wow, this was really hard, really complicated. I don't really see much redemption in it. I don't see how the kids were helped. Like even, people will often say like, well, that was all for nothing. Like those kids were here. There was damage, emotional damage to your biological kids and your marriage. And then those kids moved on with nothing changed. And they're like, okay, well, that was all wasted. And obviously nobody else in that church chooses to foster because at least for a long time until the narrative of what happened kind of disappears and people start to forget about it. And then there's a new family that's all rosy eyed and ready to go at it again. But that's the most common story, right? But I also do want to circle back. Love is never wasted. Just make sure I say that. That people who look and say, okay, that was wasted. There's something theologically there that we'd have to wrestle with that we probably don't have time for today.
Yeah.
But the story that is told within a church either motivates the mission and moves it forward, or it kills momentum. And this happens with anything you're doing within a church or within a community. The stories that are told, the ways that things play out ultimately change what happens next. For example, like in some big churches I've talked to, they might have really strategic, intentional effort to create foster care culture and ministry where they throw everything they can into getting a group of families who start to foster, right? A pastor will preach a 5-part sermon series on God's heart for vulnerable children in the foster care system. And they'll do a beautiful information session and they'll get 10 new foster parents who choose to be licensed. And then inevitably, within 6 months, more than half of those families are struggling and starting to close their license. And then the other families who continued on, some of them will end up getting to the finish line and maybe a child will reunify and then they say, well, that was so hard, harder than we imagined, and we're not doing it again. And they don't take another placement. And then some kids will end up needing to be adopted and those families will adopt. But the narrative that goes through the church as they watch those 10 families was like, wow, that was really, really difficult and really painful. And for the most part, they looked like they were lonely and struggling alone. Whereas the churches that build really strategic support systems, the churches that build life jackets for their foster families, those families, they get licensed, they experience all the same hardships, but they experience radical community. Like people who said, okay, if you are choosing to foster, if you're called to foster, then I'm called to walk this journey with you and support you. And people show up to fold laundry, to deliver meals, to do yard work, to do all kinds of help and support that cares for the family. But ultimately, like the folding laundry and the meals and the yard work aren't actually what the family needed anyways. What they needed was people in their life, um, combating the loneliness, people praying with them and praying for them, people walking the mission alongside them. And when you have close people walking it with you, the narrative changes. And even though it is hard and challenging still, people tend to go on to a point where they get past the struggle and into some of the redemptive things, not only in the child's life, but the redemptive things in their own soul, where they're starting to experience, some of what Paul talks about, like you will know Christ when you know him in his suffering. And so like I have died, he's alive for me. Like they start to realize, like, okay, what does it mean to carry my cross? What does it mean when Christ says, like, in this life there will be trouble of many kinds, but take heart, right? Like he wasn't talking about in just life in general, there's struggles of losing your job or struggles of a car breaking down. Like, no, he's talking about like in the life of following him, right? Which the life of following him is a gospel centered, laying down our life for our community. Like, if you're living a gospel centered life, you're going to run into struggle of every kind. And all these scriptures start to come alive, and families start to say, okay, this is really, really hard, but I feel a transformation happening in me. I feel the community and the people of God walking with me, and they're being transformed too. The people who are walking closely with this family are starting to experience Christ in new ways. And you start to get to the redemptive stories, which are often not even about the children themselves. It's the redemption that Christ is doing in us. And those stories tend to create the next generation of foster parents in a church and the next generation of foster parents. Whereas the church that just did a 5-part sermon series, got a bunch of foster parents, they struggled and burnt out. Usually, after all the effort they put in, a couple of years later, they can see that, oh, actually, it was just a big push and it didn't become part of the identity of the church. So the identity comes in when things are strategic and thoughtful, and the story that's being told continues to fuel the mission.
So now that we have this picture of the negative impact of the wrong testimonies, or ones where foster families and adoptive families weren't supported as well as they could have been, and we also have seen what a positive, redemptive testimony cycle does. Can you give us a picture of like what does a successful ministry look like? I know that through our conversations, it often starts with leading the church in a 30-day of prayer with the guide you guys have done or some sort of prayer. But knowing that prayer is the beginning, what are the other components that make this a successful ministry?
The analogy that I often use for helping create successful ministry or successful culture, um, where God's heart for vulnerable kids and families is a big part of your church. The analogy I often use involves an apple tree. Right? So I think everyone wants an apple tree to be producing lots of beautiful, healthy apples. And the strategy that a lot of churches often mistakenly take is what I'll call the shake the tree method, where it's like going to preach a sermon series on foster care and do an interest meeting and see if we get some foster parents and then move on and never think about it again. And that's the extent of what they do. And that's really just shaking the tree. You just shake the tree and see what apples fall off. Because in your church, at any given time, there's people sitting in the pews who are thinking and wrestling with foster care and adoption. We know that even, because statistically, if you poll all Christians across the country, about 25 to sometimes as much as 30% of all Christians would say that they've seriously considered foster care, even to the point that they have looked into the process of how to do it, like how to become licensed. And it's higher for adoption. It's about 45% of all Christians have considered and prayed about and looked into becoming an adoptive parent. But less than 5% of believers ever adopt, and less than 2% of Christians ever foster. So there's this big gap between the number of people who are thinking about it and praying about it and the ones who actually do it. So if you, at any given moment, preach a sermon series on foster care or adoption, there are people already out there who are in that moment of their life where they're thinking about it and they're praying about it and they're wrestling with the Lord. And you doing that it could possibly move those people from thinking, considering to actually saying yes. But really, you're just shaking the tree to see which apples were ready to fall anyways. And sometimes the apples that fall aren't even always the right apples. Sometimes, right, they're families who might be not even motivated by the right reasons, or they might have some of their own reasons why they maybe shouldn't jump right in. But a really compelling sermon on foster care could move some people to say yes. And they might not even be the right families who say yes. So you shake the tree, you get apples to fall, not always the right apples. But a much healthier approach to an apple tree, right, is not shaking it. It's cultivating the soil, creating a healthy environment for that tree. It's pruning it in a healthy way. It's strategic and thoughtful of what branches need to be cut. Because an apple tree that's been well pruned will produce more apples and healthier apples, and it will produce them year over year over year. And that is a much more intentional way to approach ministry at your own church. Instead of saying, what am I going to do that could get a couple of people to foster right now? It's thinking, what could I do to change the environment, to change the way people think, to change the way people feel about, foster care, adoption, vulnerable families, in a way that will shift culture year over year over year. And for a lot of churches, what that looks like is taking time to thoughtfully preach the gospel in a way that invites people to do really hard things. A lot of churches are great at preaching the gospel that leads us to salvation, right? Which is good. Praise God, right? Like Jesus died so that we could be made free. He died to wash away all of our sin. He died to bring us into a family that he could adopt us and call us his own. And some churches don't as often get to the part of the gospel where they say, and we are invited to participate in that gospel going forward in the earth. And often what that looks like is carrying the pain and brokenness of this world, right? Like Jesus said, he's going to build his church and they're going to push back the gates of hell. The darkness will not prevail, but you're not going to show up at the gates of hell and do some pushing without it being enemy territory, right? Like we enter into enemy territory and it gets heavy and it gets hard. And that is clear all through scripture that the life of following Christ is costly, right? Like salvation is free, but following Jesus is hard and costly and often costs us everything. We change our whole future. And churches that spend time preaching that message for 6 months, 8 months, a year of what does it look like to do the hard things of the kingdom, the churches that do that well, that's cultivating the soil. That then a year later, when they start saying words like foster care and adoption, people in our church start going, yeah, we should be thinking about that. Whereas the soil of their heart would not have been ready for this message. And the year over year intentionality of creating the next step for your church. The first step might be preaching the gospel that invites people to do the hard things. And the next step might be inviting your people to pray and really intercede for these children and families. And then the next step might be inviting people to foster. And then the next step might be inviting people to radically support the people who are doing it. But year over year, taking the right next step to intentionally cultivate the culture and prune the environment that you're building with thoughtful prayer and strategy, that often builds long-term outcomes where there are families year over year over year that are choosing to foster rather than just a one-time shake the tree kind of environment.
So, what resources are there in helping people to navigate how to get this going? And, you sort of mentioned like that timeline could be long,
Mhm.
for anyone out there, myself included, who's very motivated, motivated person, we long for things to happen quickly.
Mhm.
And if we even go to any illustration like you gave of cultivating an apple tree or growing something, we understand innately that it takes a while to bear fruit.
Mm.
Like you don't plant an apple seed and then grab an apple out of the soil, right? Like it's a long time. But there's still like people want to know practical ways that they can do stuff. So are there specific resources, whether it's from Agape or through the other resources that you've shared in this conversation, that they can start implementing some of these things and get moving?
Yeah. Yeah. It does take time. I'll often tell pastors and folks that I'm working with that it might be 3 to 5 years before you start to see noticeable fruit, meaning like you might see a few foster parents right away, but it'll be years before you start to see like, oh, this is actually taking root in our culture, that this is a fruitful new identity of the church. So it does take time, but there are incredible resources that help. And there are tools and there are people who want to walk with churches. And there's also really incredible strategy that we've learned. There's now thousands of churches across the country who've been committed to this type of ministry for years, if not decades. And those churches are sharing what they've learned of what does it look like to cultivate this environment. And some of the messages that we hear from those churches that have been at it for 10 or 15 years, they'll say things like, we often dramatically overestimate what we're going to do in 1 year, but we dramatically underestimate what we can accomplish in a decade. And those churches will look back on their first baby steps of trying to develop culture and they'll say that was messy. We did not know what we're doing. We did not have good strategy. We're just trying the best we could. We saw very little fruit. But then 10 years later, they look back and they say, wow, look at all that God has done. And we are a different church than when we started. There's churches I interact with that now are 15 years into the process and they can look back and they can see hundreds of children who have come through the doors of their church, have been fostered, hundreds of children who've been adopted into families of their churches. And their children's ministry is different because of it. Their youth ministry is different. The very fabric of their church has changed to be a place that is loving to those who are most vulnerable, the families and biological families included, who are through the doors of the church now. And the church is a beautiful representation of Christ's heart in ways that it wasn't at the beginning. But at the beginning, you often need people to walk with you and support your church to make sure that you're getting the wisdom from other churches and to make sure you're getting tools and resources that help. Because as things come up, you'll need the right tool for that season in your church, whether it's trauma training and strategy or strategy for building wraparound care teams for foster families, or new equipping when your church starts to begin to engage with biological families in a new way. Whatever it is that comes up, you'll need support, and making sure that you're not doing it alone has been really important. And even like more practical, at Agape and within the community here, there is tools from a national organization called Promise 686, which they create video tools and strategies and all kinds of resources and training for churches wherever they are in the process, whether they're just getting started or if they're a few years into the process, or if they need help walking it year over year in cultivating that tree and cultivating the soil. We use Promise 686 and we just get those tools and resources to churches so that they have what they need, while we continue to walk with them and support them relationally, but making sure that they have everything in their tool belt that they might need along the way. So getting churches access to those kind of things makes a real difference.
Yeah. So connecting a couple of the things that you've shared in this section, knowing that it could take 1, 3, 5 years to really build that culture. But you mentioned you may have some people who are ready right off the bat to like jump in the water.
Mm-hmm.
How do you ensure that you're supporting those people that are already ready before the culture is there, to make sure that the testimony doesn't become one of those negative ones,
Mm-hmm.
but is a positive while you're still building the culture?
Yeah. When I'm talking with a new pastor, who's wondering about, this kind of ministry or this kind of culture in their church, one of my first questions is often, do you have anybody in your church who's fostering right now? And often there is one or two families who are already doing it. And I'll ask them, well, how are they doing? How are they faring in the midst of the mission that they're called to? And they'll usually say, "Oh, I think they're fine. They seem fine." I'll say, "Okay, well you should go ask them how they're doing." One, those parents feel so loved and so honored when their pastor comes to actually check on them, because these families who are already fostering, they've said yes to something that they feel. They feel this mission inside of them. They feel that DNA, the Father's DNA, to love the vulnerable. But for the most part, they've been doing it alone. So their pastor coming to check on them is so affirming of what's even happening in them and their heart. But usually they do have some struggle happening. Usually they feel like they're in that ocean without a life jacket. And it's good for the pastors to learn that the people in their own church who are already doing it, who seemed okay on the surface, actually were feeling lonely and unsupported and misunderstood often in the mission that they're called to. Helping pastors start with what's already happening in their church and actually evaluate, okay, what's already happening? What are the passions here? What are people already doing? Are they already engaged in supporting different nonprofits or already involved in this? And who are our families who are already fostering? And then from there, starting to make support for those families a non-negotiable at their church. Beginning to change the narrative that there are families in our church who are living a pretty radical expression of the gospel right here in our own community, by loving and welcoming those children who are in desperate need. And from the stage and from the communications of the church, making it known that people who choose to live this mission are going to be supported, that they are going to be loved and cared for the same way that we care for anyone else who lives a radical mission, right? Like, we don't send missionaries off to the ends of the earth and send them unsupported and not prayed for and not covered and not cared for. And we don't send them without getting them the rest or the care that they need. But yet we have people who are living a really challenging mission right here in our city, and they're often unsupported. So changing that narrative in their church is a real non-negotiable. Usually, when a pastor does that, when they successfully change that narrative, where they say, here are the one or two families who are already fostering, and we're going to support them, and they build strategic support to support them, usually that's all that's needed to actually get 2 or 3 more families who were already thinking about it. They were already kind of wrestling with the fears and wrestling with their concerns, praying through it and processing what their place in the story is. And then they see that their church is committing to supporting families. And then that's usually enough for them to say, okay, if my church knows that this mission is important and they're going to support people who do it, then I'm not as afraid anymore. So that's often a first step in not shaking the apple tree, but cultivating a healthy culture and finding those first families who are ready to do it. And then from there, you can start to think, okay, how do we actually build the systems? How do we tell the stories? How do we create the environment where these families who are living the mission can thrive? They can find Christ in it. It's forming and shaping them. It's just like they are becoming like Christ. It's discipling them as they say yes to what God's called them to do. And it begins to form and shape the people around them. Like the church starts to engage in the mission alongside these families. And over time, that builds the next steps for the church. And they'll, down the road, start finding their next places, whether it's serving youth aging out or helping biological parents, or it just begins to birth the next steps year over year. But the first thing for pastors is often, let's learn what's already happening. Let's change the narrative within our own church. And then let's strategically build the next steps after that.
Yeah. So we've covered a lot of ground in this conversation, from those who are uninformed, unaware, those who are actively considering foster care and adoption, those who don't feel like they're equipped but want to be a part of supporting, to even church leaders. What encouragement would you give as we wrap this up to all of these different people who are all a part of the body of Christ, looking to make impact for vulnerable children and their families? What encouragement would you leave them with today?
I think the encouragement that I would give to people is that it's okay to be wrestling with the fears and uncertainty of what their part to play in the story is. Like, what is their place along the river? I think everybody wrestles with that. That's very normal. But everybody is called to do something. Like, that is very clear throughout all of Scripture. And it's very clear within our own spirit. We all know we're supposed to do something, right? There's no pastor, there's no church, there's no person we talk to that when we talk about foster care, adoption, and we talk about vulnerable families, there is nobody, no believer that really says, yeah, that's not for us, or that's not my thing. We all know in our spirit, because the Holy Spirit is in us and with us, and the Father's DNA lives through us, that we are moved with compassion to love and serve those who need it. We just don't often know what to do or what practical steps to take. So it's normal to wrestle. It's normal to have fears and uncertainty. But my encouragement, I think, to everybody, whether you're thinking about fostering or finding a way to support or helping mobilize your church, the encouragement is to not be afraid of what you think is impossible. I think we all feel like we're not good enough or smart enough or compassionate enough to make a difference in the world or in our community, or even to make a difference for one person or one child. We feel very inadequate. And I don't think that Jesus is intimidated by that, right? Like, our inadequacy and our feelings of not being enough, I think, is exactly where we're supposed to be. I don't think that when Jesus looked at the disciples and told them to feed the 5,000 people, that they thought, yeah, we got this. Right. But yet, and I don't think when the disciple, I imagine Peter, I don't know why I imagine Peter, but I imagine Peter coming back with the lunch. I don't think he came to Jesus being like, you're so good and so amazing, and I know that you're God of the universe, so here, multiply this and feed the people. I think when he came back, it's more like, we told you there wasn't any food here, Jesus. Like, I think it was like a I told you so attitude. And the title of all of our Bibles says Jesus feeds 5,000. Jesus took the food and he broke it and he blessed it, but he handed it back to the disciples and he told them the same thing again. He said, Go pass it out. Go feed the people. And I doubt, I mean, the first time he told them and they didn't believe, I'm sure the second time when they handed it back, they were like, okay, I guess we start passing it out. So yeah, Jesus fed 5,000, but the disciples fed 5,000, right? They passed out the food because they chose to obey. They could have stood there and been like, this isn't like, there's not enough. Why would we start passing it out? There's not enough food here. They could have chose not to. But yet somebody decided to break off a chunk of that bread and start giving it to somebody. Like somebody obeyed. And then the other disciples started to obey. Like, I wonder which one did it first. Like, which one, well, Jesus said to do it, so we're going to do it. I think we have to have that kind of attitude where we're like, this all feels too big. This all feels too complicated. Like, there is no way that we could possibly solve the foster care crisis, right? But somebody's got to break off a chunk of bread and start passing it out. And until people start to obey, even though it feels impossible, where it's like, this feels bigger than me. I don't know what I actually could do, but I'm going to take a step of obedience. It's not until we start to obey in places that feel impossible that we start to see miracles. So I feel like that's my encouragement for folks. Is like, yeah, we all know that this feels bigger than you because we feel it too. Like, this feels so much bigger than me. Like, every act of obedience in the kingdom usually requires some kind of radical faith where you're like, this feels bigger than me, but I feel like I'm supposed to do it anyways. And that's where we start to see miracles happen. So that's my biggest encouragement. It's like, don't get intimidated by the size of the problem, because we have a bigger God. And he's a God of more than enough, right? He didn't provide just enough food for that crowd. He provided more than enough, right? He didn't provide just enough manna in the desert. He provided more than enough. And consistently through all of Scripture, we see that we have a God of more than enough. So we have to believe that that's true right now, today, in the midst of this crisis, in the midst of families and children in need right here in our communities. We have a God of more than enough, but we have to show up and start passing out the bread, right? We have to show up with our lives and opening our heart and our homes and not being afraid of saying no to how the culture tells us to live and saying yes to how the gospel calls us to live. So
That's super, super impactful. This has been such a great conversation. And our hope is for you all out there that this has just been an encouragement, that it's helping you to navigate some of these questions that you have, and that you can realize that you don't have to have it all worked out to move forward or to make action. So you can visit Agape's website. You can reach out to the team there if you have further questions. And yeah, hopefully this has just been a blessing and can help you navigate such a unique but needed ministry and challenge.
it's good. Thanks so much, Greg. This was fun.